Welcome to T is for Trauma. I'm your host, David O'Connor. My guest today is my good friend, Danny Mulvihill. And this was a fun one to record, as Danny has his own podcast called the Mind State Podcast, and we recorded 2 episodes back to back where we each interviewed the other for our respective shows. In this episode, Danny talks about growing up in a single-parent home, why he chose to stop drinking without the use of a traditional 12-step program, how, as an adult, he struggled with overspending, which is also something I strongly identified with, and how his life was changed after spending more than 2 months in a county jail. It is a wide-ranging and dynamic conversation, and one that I think people will get a lot of value from. If you're also interested in hearing Danny's interview with me, it is available right now at mindstatepodcast.com. And we talk about childhood trauma, the merits of traditional talk therapy versus psychedelic therapy, and how process addictions can subtly undermine our behavior without our knowledge. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Danny Mulvihill. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. It is so great to be here.
Yeah, so I've been starting off every episode with gratitude, and I am especially grateful to you because you were a big inspiration in launching this show. You have your own podcast, the Mind State Podcast, which we have just finished recording a 2-hour episode that I am super excited to see how it comes out. And I was also grateful for the opportunity to tell my story. But you were somebody who, when I had this idea to start a podcast, we met entirely by chance. Mm-hmm. And we can get into that in a little bit, but I didn't know anybody who had a podcast. I didn't know anything about launching a podcast. And you were incredibly generous with your time. You answered all of my stupid questions. You gave me a lot of good advice in terms of what to buy, what services to use, where to host it, all of that stuff. But then also you provided a lot of pressure or urgency and
accountability.
Perfect word. I was going to say in a very good way for getting me to launch, because I was very in my own head and I was like, oh, I don't know, like if I'm ready to tell this story. There's a lot of external factors. And you were like, hey, I went through the same thing. Just pick a date and put it out. And I did. And then I didn't stick to that. But then I picked another date, and the podcast has now been out for almost a month. And I wanted to say thank you for being that inspiration for me.
You're welcome. And, I appreciate your gratitude, and really kudos to you for doing it, because you're not the first person who I bugged to pick a launch date and to just do it and to just start, but you are the first person to follow through.
Awesome.
So you deserve some credit too.
So the place that I wanted to start is actually how we met. And we had a chance encounter at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and specifically Renzo Gracie Austin, where by complete chance we were on the mats one morning and some guys were talking to you about crypto and about your podcast. And I was like, wait a minute, I work in crypto and I'm trying to launch a podcast. I need to go introduce myself to this guy. And we became fast friends after. And essentially, I don't know when your episode is going to come out, but spoilers for people. The place that we ended it was a very cool conversation about the concept of jiu-jitsu as therapy and whether it is therapy or it's not therapy, and people's perception of that, and also our own personal feelings on it. And the place that I wanted to start with you was how you came to find martial arts and also Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because my own personal story was, as a child, we were never allowed do any sort of martial arts, and also just fighting or violence was also incredibly discouraged. It was very taboo or savage, and it was just not the okay thing to express yourself in that way. And so I came to jiu-jitsu incredibly late. I came to jiu-jitsu probably at 25, 26, and that was the first martial art that I had practiced. And it has been very helpful for me personally in terms of something that you touched on that I think is very beneficial for people is it allows you to build a competence in something, which I think is something that a lot of people struggle with. They don't have any direction in their life, but they also don't feel good at something. And it is very difficult to have self-esteem when you're not good at anything. So it has allowed me to dive into something and become good at something, but then also there is all of the self-confidence from being able to take care of yourself, knowing how to de-escalate situations, knowing when you're in danger, when you're not in danger, and then also just all of the friendships that I have accumulated along the way. And like we talked about in your podcast, how I really liked the people in jiu-jitsu, and I really feel like those people are my tribe. And I was wondering what the path was for you that got you into both martial arts, and if there was something before jiu-jitsu and how you got to today.
Sure. Yeah, this will be fun to dig into. So first, I'm surprised about your story of violence being so discouraged in your youth. I would have thought that being Irish, that it was almost glorified. And so, but just a misperception there. So my story, we'll kind of start like as an adult, but then back it up. So I, as an adult, got into martial arts. Actually, I never was able to do it as a kid. We were just, didn't have the money for it really. But I said I was going to start as an adult, and here I am jumping back to childhood. Just makes more sense chronologically, I guess. So my brother and I, my younger brother Ryan, who's 4 years younger than me, we were obsessed with ninja movies, and we were watching Bloodsport and all the Van Damme movies, probably earlier than we should have. But we just loved that stuff, and like the fighting video games, all of it. But we couldn't actually do martial arts. And then as an adult, my wife and I were, I think this is when we lived in, I'll just say Portland, Oregon, so people don't think I'm from Canada. We were going to be traveling to South America, planning a trip, and it actually took a few years before we made it there. But I remember thinking, like, I'm not like a big, intimidating guy, and I don't know how to fight, really. I've come out on top in most of my chance encounters up until that point, but, mostly maybe I was just a little more athletic than the people I fought, and they were equally unskilled at violence. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to try to figure out how to like de-escalate situations, like maybe if I can make people laugh or understand how to psychologically beat somebody in a confrontation, I can avoid violence altogether and sort of take a shortcut, not have to know how to be violent. And I came across one guy, I don't remember his name now, but he basically really quickly made the case that if you want to be able to effectively de-escalate a situation, then the only way to do that is to know that if you're unsuccessful in the verbal de-escalation, that you must be able to be successful in the physical de-escalation. And I was like, well, shit, I guess I have to learn how to, I guess in some sense I was excited, I had always wanted to do martial arts, but I was like, well, there's no shortcut. And so this was, probably 14 years ago. And I was like, all right, well, got to learn how to fight, got to do some martial arts. And my brother had already been doing jiu-jitsu a little bit, and had always, whenever he finds something cool, I'm one of the first people he tells, like, you should do this thing, you should do this thing. And jiu-jitsu is one of the ones where I was in college, I was broke then too. So the idea of like paying dues and even just the time that it would take to go, like, it didn't work out. Finally, some things were I felt like I would have the time to do it. And I looked around, and jiu-jitsu wasn't as available then as it is now. It still is a lot easier to find than, in the 90s. Like, a lot of people had to go meet in a garage. But unfortunately, I didn't find a jiu-jitsu gym. I found a Krav Maga gym. And I was like, well, whatever. It was like a mile and a half away from my house. And even then, I knew that location was key. Like, it's important to know, like, you got to be able to get there. So I signed up and I go and I'm super excited. The very first class, the guy's like, "Hey, you look like GSP." Probably just brushing, like,
Yeah.
he knew what he was doing. And so I sign up. I'm super stoked. I'm learning how to beat people up, I think. And within a few days, I'd call my brother and I'm like, "Hey, I signed up for Krav Maga," expecting like this outpouring of brotherly support.
Yeah.
And he's just like, "What?" Like, would you learn how to poke people in the eyes and kick them in the nuts? And I was like, "Yeah, actually, that's exactly what we did on day one." So anyways, I stuck with it for like 9 months until we moved out of that city. Got my yellow belt in Krav Maga.
There you go.
I did learn a few things, but a lot of what, ultimately I lost interest in was that I noticed that most of the students were there to lose weight, not to learn how to fight. Like, it felt more like a cardio kickboxing class than like a martial arts class. Anyways, we moved and I wasn't able to get back into martial arts in Reno, and we were only there for 9 months and ended up in Austin. And I was just taking the garbage out one day and I saw like a guy who had taken the garbage out right in front of me. Like, dropped my garbage off, and as I was walking back, I noticed his shirt said Paragon Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I was like, "Oh, hey, what's up, man? My brother does that, and he keeps telling me I should do it." And he's like, "Well, if you want to try it out, like, I'm your neighbor." Like, he literally his door was 8 feet away from mine.
Was he a student or a teacher?
He was kind of both. He's a brown belt at that point, and so he would definitely teach some classes, but was still a student in many ways. That was Derek Garza, by the way, for anybody who's listening and knows Derek. And he's like, "Yeah, well, I'll go to class on Monday. You're welcome to join if you want." And as he tells the story, he just never expected me to show up. Like, everybody says, like, "Oh yeah, I want to do that." Sure enough, on Monday, like 4:45, I knock on the door. I'm like, "Hey," wearing shorts. And he's like, "What's up, man?" I'm like, "I'm ready to go to jiu-jitsu." And he's like, "All right," and she's like, "This is going to be awkward."
Yeah.
Just 20-minute drive.
I got a choke my neighbor unconscious.
Right. But anyways, he took me to my first class, and I went to, I think, 2 or 3 classes in the first like free week trial. But my first daughter was about to be born, so I wasn't quite ready to commit to the full, like, you had to sign a contract for a year back then. I was like, "I don't know, I'm going to wait." Ended up signing a different gym, but that's how I got it started in jiu-jitsu. And martial arts in general was, loving it as a kid, and then wanting to learn how to de-escalate situations for when we traveled to South America, and ultimately realizing that if you want to be able to de-escalate, you have to know how to physically beat people up. And, you kind of alluded to this point later, is that it builds so much self-confidence that it's not just about the physical ability to fight. That's really nice, and honestly, jiu-jitsu is just a heck of a lot of fun. But it seeps into so many other aspects of your life, like even interviewing for a job, or negotiating for a higher salary, or negotiating when buying a car, or almost any situation where it's not necessarily conflict, but there's some two parties maybe wanting different things. Knowing that you could beat that person in a fight, like, it takes a lot of the pressure out of the situation. Yeah. You're like, I'm not worried about, like, you can't hurt me.
And I think also just the reps of being comfortable being uncomfortable.
That's a perfect way to really highlight that, is you get so much practice just facing adversity. And the more you do that, the more it's just easier to face difficult things.
And then I think also, like, the situations that jiu-jitsu puts you in, where there is a simulation of danger, and there is also this, because for someone who hasn't done it, you are simulating a real fight, or at least a real grappling fight. Mm-hmm. And somebody might put you in a chokehold, which is a proxy or a simulation of somebody effectively trying to kill you. Mm-hmm. And you can get yourself into this bad situation, and then you just tap out and the situation resets, and you get to do those reps of going all the way up to that point of danger without really being in any tangible danger. And I think that's not an experience that a lot of people get to have in their everyday life. But then also when they get put in a situation that is intense or extreme, when you don't have those reps under your belt, that can be very disorienting for people, or like people can freeze up or like just take off or freak out. And I think having that experience is a lot. It helps you be level-headed in those situations, and kind of like also just breathing is a major part of jiu-jitsu, and like it just helps you self-regulate and also down-regulate your stress in these stressful situations.
Yeah, big time. It's one of the main things I tell new people that are starting jiu-jitsu. Rather than like show them some cool technique or some little detail in their movement, I'm like, just pay attention to your breathing.
Yeah.
If you do that, you'll be twice as good at jiu-jitsu. It's that easy.
Yeah.
Breathe through your nose.
There are so many different parts that I want to touch on in what you just talked about. And the first one that I want to kind of get to, which is an anecdote that I have not shared with anybody, and it's kind of embarrassing, but it's also on topic. And it was, you had said like, oh, that surprises you that I don't have much, or fighting was taboo given the Irish culture. And it's definitely true that like fighting is a big part of the Irish heritage, but I think the environment I was raised in, we rejected a lot of those principles. So like the drinking and the fighting and like the boorishness was very discouraged. Like we were like, oh, we're better than that.
Interesting.
So in my second MDMA experience, my third MDMA experience, for people who are not familiar with it, you start a voice memo on your phone and you articulate the things that you're experiencing throughout the session. And so I'm settling in to start this third session, and I'm waiting for the medicine to kick in. And the first observation or takeaway hits me. And also, important context, there is generally a facilitator in the room with you to make sure you're okay. And like, they can also make notes if you ask them to, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm waiting for this first observation to hit, and it hits me, and I sit up in the bed and I like take my headphones off and my eye mask off, and the facilitator's like, hey, you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I just need to write something down. And they go like, oh, I can write it down for you. And I was like, no, I'll write it down myself. And I reached into my bag and I took out a pen and pad, and I wrote down, you hate Conor McGregor because he's fierce, rich, and respected. and you know, to kind of like tie that into the previous point, I had, you know, people are like, oh, you're from Ireland, like, and you do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like, do you know Conor McGregor? Yeah, do you love Conor McGregor? And I'd be like, no, I don't like that guy. Like, he's kind of a jerk. Like, he's a bully. Like, he's, you know, like his party is out of control. Like I don't identify at all with that guy. And then I have this realization in this session that like, there's actually a lot of jealousy on my part in that, because like this guy, I mean, this was, you know, pre-downfall Conor McGregor. I don't know if he'd even fought Khabib at this point, but like he was essentially top of the world. And, you know, the fierce part, he was kicking ass and taking names, like 2-division champ. He was rich, like undeniable that he was printing money, and also he was respected. Like he has hundreds of millions of followers on social media, and like all of these people are like envious of his lifestyle.
A fair amount of those followers hate him also, though.
100%.
To be
and
fair.
you know, like that is also part of the draw, just like Floyd Mayweather. But like, I was taking this very moralistic, objective stance of like, I do not approve of this guy from an ethical perspective. But I was like, you know what? This guy actually has a lot of things that I want in my life, and the fact that this guy is getting it, and also in a way that I don't apparently approve of, is stoking up a lot of jealousy. And I was like, I had to start with that kick in the balls of like, oh, okay, like there's more jealousy here than real moralism. That's that's one that I have to kind of chew on a little bit. But then also to something else you said, like martial arts as a kid, like the 80s was a wonderful time to become interested in martial arts, because you had like the Karate Kid movies, you had like Three Ninjas.
Oh, that was my shit. My brother and I watched that movie at least 50 times.
Yeah, you had like the Ninja in G.I. Joe. There's like all of these video games like Shuriken and Ninja Gaiden, and you know, it was just, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I wanted, because you know, like I was being hurt a lot behind the scenes, and I wanted to be effective, and I wanted to be able to take care of myself, and I wanted, you know, people to stop fucking with me. And you know, like I wasn't allowed to do martial arts, so like something like the Karate Kid, where you know it starts off and he's this outsider arriving in town, and he's getting bullied, and then this guy like shows him this way where he can take care of himself. I was like, wow, like I want that for myself. So I would watch those movies and pretend like I knew karate. And you know, like the thing that I always find hilarious was like people would meet me and then they'd find out that like I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or like I trained MMA, and they'd be like, oh, I wouldn't want to pick a fight with you. And I was like, I'm a very large person. Like, were you planning to pick a fight before me? But also like I spent the first 25 years of my life hoping nobody started a fight with me. Like I never got in any sort of altercation, like in the streets or anything like that. And, you know, I feel lucky that no one tried me, because I really did not want to fight. And also I couldn't fight at all. So like people were just like, oh, that's a very large person, I'm not going to start something with him. But I was like, you know, if you did, it probably would go your way, just FYI.
I mean, it's lucky too, because a lot of people seek out the big guy for the fight.
I've heard that, but like I've never seen it. Like,
well, people who know how to fight,
right,
I think, seek out the big guy. Well, I know my brother would, when he was first learning to fight, would end up in situations where he would try to fight the big guy because he knew he could win and embarrass him.
Yeah, I mean that's that's something to think about for sure. But so putting a bow on that, but while still talking about childhood, where did you grow up?
Spokane, Washington. So
Okay.
it's like the east side of the state, like, you know, 15 minutes from Idaho. So pretty much a border town. More in the mountains, you know, so like it gets a lot colder in the winter and a lot hotter in the summer than the Seattle that you're used to when you lived there. But yeah, that's where I grew up.
Also a very different vibe, I believe, too.
Yeah, it's a lot more, you know, rural, although like Spokane's it's the second largest city in Washington, but there's still a lot of agriculture surrounding it, and this was a lot less obvious and apparent as a kid, partly probably because I didn't pay attention, not that I do now, but I think it was just less prominent, is a little more conservative and Republican focused in terms of the political climate, and just the way people think, you know, a lot less progressive and whatnot compared to the west side of the state.
Yeah. What do you remember about growing up there? Like, when you think of your childhood, like, how would you characterize it or summarize it?
Yeah, I mean, probably one of the major, like, significant events worth highlighting is, at least kind of in relationship to this podcast, would be when my parents split up. And so that happened when it was the summer right after kindergarten. So I was probably 6, I'm guessing. Wow. And I remember, I have this memory of walking down the hallway in my elementary school, and in my head right now, I'm picturing it, the ceiling seemed like 40 feet tall. They're probably not. And it's the last week or two of school, and my kindergarten teacher, I think her name was Mrs. Pothenroth, and she's like, oh, you know, hey, Danny, like, how are you doing? Are you excited about summertime? You know, do you guys have any plans? And I was like, I think my mom and I are going to go live with my grandma. And she was just like, oh, you know, like, this is me reconstructing the memory after hundreds of times. So who knows what her real response was, but thinking about it now, I bet she was probably like, "Oh shit."
Yeah, she had more
That
macro awareness than you did as a 6-year-old.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so but the weird thing was, like, I never, at least to my awareness, I didn't go through that situation where I thought it was my fault or I wanted my parents to stay together or anything. Like, I was sort of excited to tell my teacher that we were going to go live with my grandma.
Yeah.
And I don't remember this, but probably in the last year or something, I was talking to my mom about it, and she had said that she was really worried about, like, the potential split and how that would affect especially me, because, you know, I'd hang out with my dad a lot, and she just kind of talked to me about it one day to try to get a pulse on, you know, how that would go. And she said that she just kind of brought it up, like, "Hey, what do you think about maybe living with Grandma Doris?" And I guess I was just like, that'd be awesome. Let's go.
Yeah.
You know, because they had been fighting a lot. And I don't remember this at all, but apparently I was just like, let's do it. And she's like, that's the moment I knew that we had to leave, you know? And so we split, went and lived with my grandma for a few months until my mom found a place for us to live. And then, gosh, a lot of my childhood, I remember feeling, it seemed like we didn't really have money. Like,
Yeah.
I was never hungry or anything, you know, like, it wasn't really bad, but, like, you know, I got clothes at the beginning of the school year, and those were my clothes for the year. And when other friends were going to do things like going to the movies or going to the fair, a lot of times I wasn't participating. We just didn't have the extra money to do it. Like I said, I didn't, you know, martial arts wasn't even really on the table.
Yeah.
I was able to, like, join a soccer league for a little while, but then I was kind of at the age where, like, I only did it for maybe a year, I think. And the next level was called select soccer. And I guess the price was just, like, way out of our league. And I don't know at all what it was.
Yeah.
But, you know, it just wasn't on the table. And so I couldn't do soccer. And thinking about all this stuff now and, like, what it's like being a parent, that just must have been so tough. Like, on my mom to have to say no, you know, like.
Do you have many memories of asking for things and being told, or was that something that you intuited it just wasn't? And
I have one, like, specific strong memory, which was, I think I was probably in about 4th grade because of the house or the place that we lived in. And I remember being in the driveway, like, just kind of playing alone. And one of my friends who was a neighbor next door was going to be going to the fair, like, that was in town for a few weeks. And a few other people were going. I think some of his cousins were going with him. And I really wanted to go. It sounded like so much fun.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, I asked my mom, like, hey, can I go? And she's like, I don't know, you can't. Like, and I just didn't get it, you know, the same way that sometimes my kids will ask me for things. And in my case, it's more like, I can't give you everything. And so no.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we probably have the money that, you know, we could do it most of the time. It's more a matter of, like, I don't want them to be spoiled. And maybe it's just like I'm trying to force my own childhood on them and say no sometimes, who knows, some dark shit like that. But I remember, like, just not getting it, like, not understanding. The concept of, like, not having money, I think I thought that she just wouldn't give it to me. Like, it didn't click that she actually didn't have it to give, you know. That's probably my clearest memory of saying no. But then I also, like, whenever my mom did have money for some reason, she was incredibly generous with it, you know, like, because her and my dad were split up, like, you know, he was supposed to pay child support, but he was kind of inconsistent with work and payments and things like that. And so it wasn't something she could rely on and then, like, sort of plan our life around that money existing.
Yeah.
It would just, like, all of a sudden, like, 6 months worth would show up, you know, like, he'd get a job, make a bunch of money. And at some point they probably just started, like, taking it from him.
Right.
And also, like, not like my dad he had his own things going on. I think he was happy to pay it when he felt like he could, but it just wasn't consistent. And when those things happened, you know, she'd be very generous and like try to, I think, fulfill all those times she had to say no. Or I remember like one time she got like a credit card or something and, you know, like bought me this like $500 stereo that I was so stoked about. Like I love that thing. I blew the speakers out of that thing and still rocked it for years, you know? But to kind of answer your question, those are some of the clear memories I have around just being kind of poor growing up and not feeling like I could have like the cool clothes or the cool shoes or, you know, that kind of thing. And some of that stuff is so important as a kid, you know, like you want to fit in, and it just wasn't there to happen.
And you also don't want to feel less than as well.
Yeah.
And I think as adults, we can have that emotional maturity and be like, oh, like the stuff does not make the person, or like all of those things do not make you happy. But as a child, when you don't have awareness of that, or like you don't have that perspective, all that stuff seems so important, and everything seems like the biggest deal or the end of the world. And you know, all of those little experiences can add up to something pretty adverse for somebody.
Well, and you know, they still, even with my, you know, blazing adult intellect and the ability to discern between the value and lack of value of material things, I still wrestle with it. I have awareness of it now, but like I still like, it's something I've gotten a handle on the last few years is just not blowing all of my fucking money. You know, like before.
We got to talk how to do that. I'm still not there.
You're struggling? Yet. Yeah, no, I definitely have some things to share there. It's gotten a lot better, but for the longest time, like the concept of having money and not spending it just did not click.
Yeah.
A lot of credit for that really goes to my wife, because she sort of had an opposite experience of where similarly she didn't have much money, but she gravitated towards being a super saver, whereas I became a super spender. Luckily, we're balancing each other out, and she's learned how to spend money a little bit from me, and I've definitely learned how to save money a little bit from her. So, yeah, but it's still there, and I'm trying to be cognizant to not like I don't want my kids to feel spoiled, or I don't want them to feel entitled, really. Yeah. And one thing that is really frustrating for me is when we'll be at the store and they're like, hey, can we get this? And like, we there's nothing they could ask for at the store that I couldn't buy them, like realistically. But a lot of times I'm like, you don't need that shit. You know, this is some stupid toy or like some garbage food that's not good for you. So it's more like I have all these other considerations. I feel really fortunate that it's not like the lack of the money to do it, but sometimes I'm like, you know what? Yeah, sure, go ahead. And what drives me crazy is like, before the yes or the S in the word yes comes out of my mouth, they've already like, what about this? And I'm like, what about that last fucking thing I just said yes to? Like, are you kidding me?
That was a significant decision for me.
Yeah, that was a big deal. And it'll just be like, you know, like next. And I'm like, so that makes me even more careful to say yes. But I don't know what the perfect balance is, and I'm sure I'm fucking traumatizing them in some way that we'll find out in 15 years when they're on a podcast or in the metaverse or some shit.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough to know which domino it's going to, you know, knock the rest of them down. And I don't have kids, but I had a very similar experience to you where I'm the youngest of 4 kids, and Ireland in the 80s was just very poor as a country. And it wasn't until the mid-90s, you know, most of the 20th century had been bad economically for Ireland. So people were just used to not having very much. And, you know, there wasn't very much to spend your money on anyway. And things definitely got better for both the country and my family right around as I was finishing out high school. But when I started working, you know, because like a lot of my childhood had been getting hand-me-down clothes from my siblings and, you know, wanting toys or wanting like basketball shoes or whatever it was, and having to be told no. And, it, you know, much like your situation, my parents didn't have it a lot of times. And, hand-me-downs it was just the situation we were in. And our situation was by no means bad relatively. I would say we were actually pretty fortunate. But when I started working and I started making my own money, like you, I was like, oh, now I can buy everything that I was denied as a child. I'm going to recreate my childhood and just buy every toy conceivable. And, it was the adult version of those toys, in terms of like whatever it is, electronics or like food or whatever it was. But it's definitely been a learning experience having to rein that in and be like, oh, I don't have to spend every single dollar that shows up in my bank account. I can actually save some things and take a sabbatical if I need to. And,
yes.
But it's definitely been a struggle to rein that in and just like not in those times when I'm feeling less than, just act out and pull the trigger and buy something to make myself feel better.
Get a little hit of dopamine. And
absolutely.
Yep. It's fucking just like any other drug, man.
Yeah.
Spending money is, we're starting to have some cultural awareness of that. Like the phrase shopaholic exists, but like it's subtle, man. Like even when we just took a walk in between episodes, I grabbed my wallet before we went and I was like, oh, if there's a gas station, I can buy something to drink. Or like, it's like, I just need to go spend $2 or $3 fucking dollars. Like, what is that? Why? Like, and I mean, if you listen to like Huberman has this brilliant episode on dopamine that really, the guy's really good at breaking anything down, but I recommend that episode to a lot of people because it helps you to step back and look at your behaviors in terms of through the lens of dopamine. And that's when I started to realize, I'm like, oh, wow, like all these little things I want to buy, like I don't even want the thing. Sometimes like I've had the experience where I'm like, oh, I should go buy like one of these. There's these stupid like cream-filled pastry things that they sell at most gas stations that I think are delicious. And almost every time I eat one, within like 10 minutes, I'm like, oh, I feel like shit. And yet, like, and now I know that. And sometimes I'll know that and I'll still buy it.
I'm incredibly interested to find out what these things are. I've never had one, but this sounds like an experience I want to have.
All right, after this, we'll go get one, and then we'll feel like shit together.
There you go. We had talked about a little bit in the episode we recorded for your podcast. I had talked about process addictions and how that can be an expression of trauma, and when you don't address the underlying trauma. And for those listening, when I say process addictions, I'm not talking about substance addictions like drugs or alcohol. I'm talking about things like gambling addiction or sex addiction or internet addiction, shopping addiction, workaholism, working out, et cetera, et cetera. And when you don't address the underlying issue, a lot of times it can become whack-a-mole because the person is looking to escape this discomfort that they're feeling internally, and they just need something to numb out. And when they get awareness that something is an issue, it generally just jumps to a different process addiction if you don't address that catalyst that is causing this acting out internally. And I had shared my own experiences with that I have experienced almost all of the process addictions in terms of like spending addiction, internet addiction, porn addiction, sex addiction, gambling addiction, working out addiction, workaholism. And, that's definitely been my experience, that it just jumps and jumps and jumps. And like, I'm not addicted to any one of those things. Like, it's not the thing itself. It's the release or the distraction that comes with it. And in you talking about your spending and trying to get that under control, I was wondering, had you had any similar experiences with something in that vein?
With process addictions?
Yeah.
So the whack-a-mole thing resonates less. Like I've just kind of stuck with spending the whole time.
Yeah.
I used to drink, and that was definitely the thing. And really fortunately that when my wife and I both stopped drinking, I think it's been like 3 years now. And she's probably going to want to call out, I had a glass of wine in Spain, and so I'm a faker. Anyways, she's going to fucking kill me for that. So when we stopped drinking, though, to my awareness, I didn't just move that to something else. But because of that, that's when we like started getting our shit together.
Yeah.
Because we had taken away this escape that was just massive, like, because I was having beer every day. Like, usually the only time I wouldn't have a beer is because I was hungover from like having too many the day before. Yeah. That was like the only reason. And once we took that out of the equation, I just started having all sorts of like energy to get better at things and to like learn things and reading books again, and not just like sci-fi, but like actual learning books, reading nonfiction and meditation. All these things started making sense as a thing to do again. But to get at the heart of your question, I mean, I haven't so much had the experience of jumping from one thing to the other. It's more like I become aware of it and I'll start to like get a little bit of control over it. And then like if I take my attention away from it, like it comes back up and I'm like, oh, and I like tamp it back down. So it's more like I've had a couple of consistent things.
Yeah.
And it's just like trying to modulate them all into like a level where they're not negatively affecting my life too much.
So it's more like managing it rather than like switching one off and another comes on.
Yeah, in my experience, I would say that's been more the case. I'm curious to hear what my wife has to say. She might have more insight on that.
Yeah, this is something that's fascinating to me because like I don't know if you're familiar with the podcaster Ritual.
I'm familiar with him. I haven't listened to a bunch, but yeah.
So he is kind of he's in a couple of different verticals. So he's like the sober guy, but then he's also the ultra athlete and then also the vegan guy. So he has pretty diverse
If you could just drop that last one. No, I'm just kidding.
And, like there's a lot of people in the addiction or recovery space who really look to him.
Okay.
But something that he talks about quite a lot that I find fascinating, and, I think just alcohol was his thing, maybe also Coke, but he talks about like a lot of people who are in recovery end up in these
process addictions.
Well, endurance sports, where like it shifts from something unhealthy to something that's perceived as healthy, and like it's still a process addiction, but it's more socially acceptable.
Yeah.
But then also, and like that it is its own thing. But I was also listening to it was Steve-O's podcast, and I don't remember who the guest was, but Steve-O is somebody who is fascinating to me because he has completely cleaned up his life. And he is also somebody who had like basically every substance addiction and every process addiction and went to recovery for every single one of them, and is now like completely clean living and like just doesn't suffer from any of that stuff. But exactly like you were saying, he was talking about how when actually the context for this is like a lot of people who are addicted in one shape or the other, if they are successful either because of that or tangential to it. So like comedians, like they're workaholics or they have like a lot of trauma. They don't want to go to therapy and work this stuff through because they think that's where their superpower comes from. So they're like, oh, if I go fix this, then my talent is going to go away. And he was talking about how when he started to take away all of these process addictions and start to really like work through that stuff, that his productivity went through the roof, where like the only thing he is focused on now is achieving his goals. And that's something that I definitely suffer with right now, is like not distracting myself, where like I think I've gotten a pretty good handle on the more negative patterns in my life, but there's still that tendency to like browse the internet or browse social media or like play video games for hours at a time. It's like, I know I should be doing something, but there's still this And I've taken a more graceful view on it, where it's like, okay, this isn't the worst thing in the world. It's not. We're not perfect, but like it's still definitely a more gentle version, and it's not having this immense adverse impact on my life. So like, okay, we're not out of the woods yet, but we're a step closer, and we're in like a milder form of this. And I think obviously the goal is to get to the place where there's none of that stuff, but it's definitely a process, and I think people kind of have to walk their own path with that.
Yeah, and in some sense, I almost want to challenge you on that, because what I find, so I'll start with this idea that I've come across this concept a few times in the last few months, that there is no like balance in life. There's balancing.
Right.
Or balance is a verb, is the way I saw it put in the last few days somewhere. And to highlight this, let's see, when was it? A few months ago, I think the beginning of May, we went to Houston, my wife and I and our daughters, to go to a Coldplay concert. And we purposely, my wife and I, left our laptops at home so that we could just like hang out with them. And we did not know what to do.
Yeah.
It was just like, we felt we could not enjoy not working. And so there's this, I guess it's the intention, or maybe not the intention, but like the reason why we do a thing. Like if you play a video game for 3 hours to escape some problem that you don't want to face, bad. But if you play a video game for 3 hours because you have the free time and you enjoy the game, that's okay. The hard part is identifying why you're doing it, right?
Yeah.
And I know that right now this, I guess, is one thing that I'm letting myself spend a whole day on, like hanging out with you and recording a few podcasts. But there's not too many things that I'm willing to do anymore where it doesn't have this like productivity involved, or like moving the needle in some direction. And it's something I know I have to work on. I'm putting too much into productivity, and like sometimes it's hard even just to hang out with my kids without some goal in mind, and I know it's a problem, but I don't quite know how to fix it yet.
Yeah, I think of it in a lot of the same way. Like I think intention matters, and there's almost nothing that I am moralistic about. Like, I think the podcast is still in its early days, and given some of the topics that have been discussed, I could see somebody looking at the podcast and be like, oh, this podcast is pushing this certain set of values in terms of like, I've talked to some guests about taking antidepressants, or like using religion to heal trauma, or like whatever it is. And in talking about process addictions, or just addiction in general, like, I don't think there is anything wrong with drinking or hooking up or working a lot, or, taking some of your discretionary income and gambling with it. It becomes a problem when it becomes a problem for that person.
Yeah.
And that person's relationship to that thing is what matters. So I think it's very difficult to judge these things in isolation without the person themselves evaluating, like, hey, is this coming from a healthy place? Do I feel like I am actively or acting compulsively right now? And like, am I using this to numb out, or am I doing this because I enjoy it? And I think it's very easy for people to just fall into a pattern of doing something without knowing why they're doing it. And I think that's where, I think in our society, it's very common for people to just come home from work and sit in front of the TV for, a couple hours, or browse the internet for a couple hours. And one way of looking at that is like, okay, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Like you had a very busy day, and like, that's fine to like just tune out and like turn your brain off. But then also like another way is like, okay, you're doing that so that you don't have to think about something that you're unhappy about in your life. And it's really on the person to judge which side of the line they are on in that. And I think that's tricky for people, honestly.
Yeah, which is why, gosh, we need friendships to help us with that. Like, we need people, friends, and partners to kind of call us out, because we can be so blind to why we do a thing and so utterly good at convincing ourselves that it's not what it is.
Yeah.
And like, to your example with the, browsing the internet, like, if you love your work and like you just like crushed it for 8 or 10 hours and like did all this amazing shit and you want to come home and zone out, fine. But if you don't like your fucking job, when you get home, you better be working on something you do like, or you are just escaping, and it's like, you have to be able to look at these things from different angles. And I think we all got to get better at calling out our friends on things, which is hard to do. And it's really not, it's not easy, at least in American culture. I can't think of too many cultures where it's something that's acceptable to call people out very often. And if you do it too often, you're not going to have very many friends, like some people aren't ready to be called out on their shit. And so it can just be like a delicate balance, like, I didn't text you every day about when you're going to start your podcast or release your podcast, but once a week or every 2, that's when it was like, I think this is the frequency that is going to be effective, or whatever the case may be. But yeah,
I think it's tricky too, because I think people have a tendency to self-select for friend groups that share their same compulsion or mindset or just
vices.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's very hard. And like I did want to talk to you about the decision or the journey to give up drinking, but like something that I've experienced, and like I also have a number of friends who are in AA, and their story is always the same of like, I had this friend group who they were all doing the same thing, and when then I decided to get sober, there was a lot of pushback and a lot of backlash from those people, because like, oh, now I'm feeling judged or threatened in my life decisions, and you making this decision for yourself somehow impacts me or like makes me reflect. And I had similar experiences, like when there was certain things that I stopped doing or like patterns that I considered unhealthy, and like I would say to people like, hey, I'm taking a break from this, and they'd be like, hey, like there's nothing wrong with this, like you're being like judgmental or moralistic. And I'd be like, this is the decision I'm making for myself, like I'm not making any value judgment on you, like this is something that I want to do because I don't feel like I can stop. And it was eye-opening to see people react in that way for like something that I was doing for my life, that they were making this about something that it somehow impacted them.
Yeah, you hear about that a lot, and I think it's one of the biggest struggles people have, especially when they're trying to overcome substance abuse of some sort, or maybe it's even a process abuse thing. In my case, once again, it's just a matter of fortune in that my wife and I chose to do it together. Well, we just kind of like stumbled across it. We had tried to stop drinking a number of times. Like, we'd just be like, hey, we're having beers at lunchtime a lot more often than maybe we probably should. Like, let's take a break, and we wouldn't drink for 3 weeks, and then we'd be like, oh, let's have a beer. And then before you know it, you're drinking every day again, or whatever the case may be. So when it happened that we decided to try again to not drink, we were traveling in our converted school bus, like with the kids. So we didn't like have a friend group that we had to, risk alienating. It was just us. We were doing it together, which, highlights another problem. When it must be really tough when like somebody in a relationship wants to make a change and their partner doesn't. Yeah. I mean, that's tough. So for us, it was easy. We didn't have friends that we were with. We did encounter some situations where like we had met these friends, really cool people. We were traveling with them in Mexico. And when we first met up, we were drinking. And so we're fucking drinking all the time, like every day.
Yeah.
And then the next time we met up, like, gosh, when was it? I think maybe it was I don't remember the exact sequence. Maybe it must have been the time, like, we didn't fully stop drinking. We were just kind of in one of our phases, like, let's take a break. And we weren't drinking, and it was kind of hard to hang out, like it wasn't as natural and easy. And, my buddy, he kept like, he's just a really generous guy. He's like, hey man, do you want a beer? Like, do you want a drink? Like, can I make you something? I'm like, no, please stop asking me. 'Cause yes, I do. But like, but no.
Can I ask, was drinking a significant part of your early relationship with your wife? Like, did a lot of what you do revolve around drinking?
No, not really. I mean, drinking didn't really become a problem until we'd already been together a couple of years. And it was never, luckily, a problem like between us. I just mean like a personal problem. It was probably a few years after we'd already been married, and I just kind of started noticing, like, man, I'm drinking a lot. Like, when did this happen? When did I start feeling like I needed to drink every day? And so much of our early relationship, like, we would obviously drink and party. We were, she was 21 when we got married. I was 26. So there was obviously lots of drinking. Yeah. But it wasn't like a central component of our life.
In terms of that time period that you talked about where you had that realization, was there external factors that you think contributed to that lifestyle? Like, was there parts of your life that you were particularly unhappy with at the time?
Yeah, so this kind of gets at, like, some notes I took this morning thinking about, what you and I would talk about today. And one of the things I've struggled with a lot as an adult in terms of, maybe not feeling fulfilled or as happy as I, like, intuitively sense I should be at times, I'll have this feeling, this sense of, like, man, life could be better, and maybe feeling a little sorry for myself and, like, going down that road. And then I just get walloped with this, like, guilt of, like, who are you to feel bad about your life? Like, for the most part, like, it's pretty great, like, stop being such a little baby. Yeah. And so I still kind of struggle with this sense of, like, I don't feel justified in feeling unhappy. And so it makes it hard for me to deal with what might be causing my unhappiness. Like, I look at my life and after talking to you this morning about repressed memories, I'm like, did something happen to me? But, like, to my awareness, like, I didn't have any major traumatic childhood event. My parents split up and we were, like, didn't have a ton of money, but I was always loved by both my mom and my dad, and lots of extended family. Like, I had a pretty super solid extended family. My mom has 5 sisters and a brother. They're all super fucking cool. I have cousins. Like, it's a really solid family group. And so I always felt love. And yeah, nothing crazy happened. Like, even as an adult, like, I'm happily married. My wife is super awesome. We have kids, like, they're healthy. So, like, what could I possibly be upset about? And to get at your question, like, I don't know what it was that I was really trying to escape. I think it was maybe this sense of we all kind of feel like we should maybe be a little further along in life than we actually are. Yeah. Like, when we were a kid, for example, it was inevitable that I was going to be rich. I didn't know, I had no idea how, but I knew for sure it was going to happen. And I was going to be super amazing and successful and all these things. And I'm not. So, like, there's this.
Can I ask you, was part of that fantasy having stuff?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I had the same thing, but it was like, I'm going to be rich and successful, but I'm going to have the stuff. but also, like, a part of that was like, oh, lots of people are going to love me and respect me. And like, I was not ever going to feel less than again.
It was the power and the idea of being in control of my situation, like, never being able to not do a thing for something as silly as not having the money to do it. and I think I just sort of, not having a lot of money, I glorified people who did and the idea of having it. And so to attempt to get like closer to your point, I'm not quite sure, and I'm still a little unsure what it was that I was drinking to escape. I think in some sense it was not being as accomplished as I expected to be. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I encounter frequently, and it was also true of myself, and like it's how I ended up down this particular rabbit hole, and like this has been a 10-year plus journey. Like there was just, and there's a number of different ways we can go from this, but like I think my personal experience is on the more extreme end, and a lot of people just struggle with this feeling of unhappiness and not knowing why. And like we had talked in your podcast about how imperfect the therapeutic process is in both guiding people to those answers, but also just getting started on that journey. But then also like in terms of this podcast, there's two different sides to this. What I have found somewhat is like people hear the phrase trauma and they take kind of like maybe like a tough guy attitude where it's like, oh, get over yourself. Like, that's not that bad, et cetera, et cetera. Like you can't be a crybaby about every little thing. And, like it's also something that I'm trying to be cognizant of like this not being a podcast where people just get on and just like dump about their problems. Like I want it to be about the felt experience in the wake of something bad, but then also like the learnings and like how that person found healing, so that there's a resource there for people. But then, the other side to that is frequently, and like I hear this from people who, some of them had like objectively extremely bad childhoods, like grew up with a lot of like physical abuse, and in addition to verbal and psychological abuse. And they're like, oh, like I didn't have it that bad, so like I'm not going to allow myself to feel bad or ungrateful because my life is pretty good. But I think this is something of a trap for people, because I don't think it needs to be mutually exclusive. Like your life can be objectively good now, and like in my case there was a lot to be grateful for, and like I had a lot of good fortune in my life. Like a lot of my basic needs were taken care of excessively, and there was still this underlying unhappiness. And I don't think acknowledging that or digging into the hurt underneath is necessarily denying that things are pretty bad now. But also the way that I've heard it explained is like, no matter what your experience is, everybody's pain is maximum to them. So like if you grew up in like an upper class, like 1% household, and your parents were not emotionally available and just bought you everything as their way of showing love, but you had a lonely experience. If you were to explain that to most people, you probably wouldn't get a lot of sympathy. It's like, oh, boo-hoo, like you had too much stuff. But for that person, that was probably like a very sad, lonely experience. And the human condition is such that like I think there is space for that too. And like trauma is not a competition where like you're trying to have the most. It's just like being able to understand that experience and being able to navigate or process that, both for the person themselves and for the person receiving that information. I think that is important, and like it's a somewhat under highlighted skill in our society today.
Yeah, I really like that phrase, trauma is not a competition.
Yeah.
Because that also highlights at least my own personal tendency to get a little caught up in concern of what others might think, and so it's like I judge my own experience as like, oh, was that really bad enough? Like you have to earn your sadness in a sense. And usually what it comes down to, like the one pattern I've certainly identified that when I feel down is present is when I feel like I don't have the financial resources to make decisions, at will. That is always present when things feel scary.
Yeah.
And so much of my focus is around trying to fix that. But I like I've noticed lately, I started working again and I'm like, I am working a lot, like I'm trading in quite a bit to get these financial resources, and it's like, how much do I give before I've solved one problem, but then I've created this other one. And maybe it's, for example, like I'm creating a childhood experience for my own kids where they're like, my dad was working all the time or something. I'm like, it's just constant battle to find the right place to put the dial. How hard do I work? How much do I do? And remembering to not just look at it through the lens of today. Like, how much money do I have today? Or if I work this hard now for the next 6 years, then I'll be here. But then my, daughter will be 17, like, and she'll like pretty quickly, she's going to start losing interest in hanging out with me. So if I don't take time now, then I could lose out on that, like, far more meaningful and valuable experience the rest of my life of like a close relationship with my kids. So I don't know, man. Yeah.
Can I ask, in terms of the example you started with, where it comes to not having the financial resources, is that generally a number that's quantifiable, or is it like nebulous in terms of like, I just don't have enough?
Yeah, that's a good point, because if you're not careful, that could just be a constant battle your whole life. And it's not like super clearly quantified in my head. I can say for sure that there is a limit, and I think once there, like for me right now, it would just be even just being at, well, I guess my net worth, like if you cancel everything out, isn't negative, but like when I log into Mint and I see my net worth, it's deeply in the negative, when it adds up all your loans and shit, like, and it's not aware of some other assets I have. And I'm like, I first of all, like my first next step is for that number to be positive.
Right.
That number has to be above 0. That's like step 1. And then I think it needs to get to where I could just make 0 income for a couple of years and maintain like a roughly similar lifestyle. But I don't even actually want that, like I don't want to make 0 income, not because like when you're working a lot, you get in this sense of like, oh man, I just want to get to where I can like relax and not have to work so hard. And like, no, what I really, really want is to make sure that I love the work that I'm doing. Like I don't want to not work. And it's taken me a while to realize that. Like that was my goal for a decade. And like every time I'd cross paths with one of my friends, Sam, be like, oh, how's work? And like my metric of how work was is like how little of it I was doing. Like that was I'm like, oh, I'm only working like 10 hours a week right now. It's fucking great, know? And he's like, you're always trying to work less. I'm like, I guess I don't like my job, or I don't like the work I'm doing at that time, And so is it quantifiable? Yeah, but you know what? I should probably get a little bit more clarity around that and then come up with a strategic plan to get there in a time frame that makes sense in meeting all of my other goals. What about you? Would you say that there's like a clear level of resources that if you had, you'd be like, okay, we're good. Now we can.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I asked that is because that is also something that I have struggled with for a lot of my adult years. And, again, this not feeling enough, a lot of that was like, when I thought of career, there was no attention paid to job satisfaction. It was purely make money.
Yeah.
And, like in talking about process addictions, like workaholism was something that was omnipresent throughout like a lot of the last 2 decades. And it's funny because like in college, I just completely goofed around, like barely showed up to class. Took me 5 years to do a 4-year degree. And then when working started and I started to get paid to do it, I was like a madman.
Yeah.
And for most of the last 2 decades, I had a job. I was usually working on a startup or like something to like sell or like some product, and then also consulting for a startup. So like I would have 3 jobs where like my 9 to 5 was my benefits and my stable income, and then like the other 2 were wherever I was numbing out. And I just like I got on that flywheel where I was like, okay, I've now made the amount of money that I wanted to make, and I'm here now. I don't feel any happier. The problem is I haven't made enough. So I would move the goalpost and move the goalpost. And like that number kept going up. And like something that was very, I don't know if I want to say eye-opening or upsetting for me, but like when I first moved to the US, the level of success that I was encountering was very different. And I had this fantasy in my head of like, oh, like I'm going to go to the big United States of America and like I'll have made it and I'm going to be rubbing elbows with the successful and elite. And I started hanging out with, because of the person I was dating at the time, like I started hanging out with some people who had like an outlier level of success for their age. And I was like, oh, these people are miserable. Like I thought the money was going to make them happy. And, like that was very upsetting because I had this like, oh, once I make the money, I'll be happy. And I realized like, oh, kind of like we were talking about, a lot of these people got to this extreme level of success by not wanting to work on their own personal traumas and just funneling themselves into their work. But even with that knowledge, it still took me close to 10 years to, and when I say close to 10 years, I mean the start of this year, to go like, oh, stop doing stuff for the money. Like that hole is bottomless, but also like the money is not going to make you any happier. And like it, for me, it was definitely a trap and like a compulsive part. But, and like the other way that would trap me is like, the more money I make, the more I can spend. And, like if the money isn't going to make me happy, then like I can spend it on stuff that maybe will generate a temporary amount of happiness, whether it's like some new toy or like some new hobby, or like I'm real big on food, so like I can eat at this restaurant. And like it's cool to not think about money and like to like fuck around and just do things that other people get envious of, but also like this stuff was not making me any happier. And I did want to talk about the sabbatical, but I don't want to get there yet because I do want to wrap up the drinking stuff. But like I will say, even in starting my own sabbatical, like it was a huge internal adjustment for me, or just a struggle for me to stop being busy, because like I started the sabbatical and I was like, I started to get very in my own head of where people were like, hey, like that's awesome, you started your sabbatical, like what are you doing? And I'd be like, oh, I need to create value in my self-esteem by being busy, so I'm going to tell people all of the ways that I have packed my calendar out with work while I'm on this break from work. And like it took 6 weeks before I realized like, hey, you're not supposed to be busy right now. Like just heal, like breathe, just relax, recuperate. Like the point here is not to be busy, and it's not to convince people that you are successful and productive by jamming as much busyness into your calendar as possible. So, I mean, before we do talk sabbatical, like, I don't know if we wrapped up the drinking part. Like, what was the journey to that kind of like?
I mean, it's kind of funny, you know, like I said, we just, over the course of a couple of years, we would occasionally become aware of the fact that we were drinking too much. And so we'd take a break for anywhere from a week to a month. My wife had some longer stints in there. Like, obviously she had 2 kids and she didn't drink then. And then there was one time before we even had children where she just took 9 months off, like just didn't drink. She was like working as a waitress at some bars and stuff, and just was like, kind of saw the environment and was like, I don't want to be drinking while I'm around all of these people. And so she just took her own break for a while. But personally, we just taken a few breaks here and there. And like I said, we were traveling in the bus, and the way I tell the story, she doesn't quite remember it the same, but as I remember it, we showed up at this kind of remote campsite, planning to stay there like a week or 10 days or something, no real set date in mind. And we just didn't bring enough alcohol, and we kind of ran out a few days after arriving, and we didn't want to, like, our only vehicle was the bus. And so we didn't want to like go just to buy, like, we had enough food, and we're like, well, let's just take another break, right. You know, and things just aligned, and that was the time it worked. And we just stopped drinking, and then like started noticing how much energy, and not just energy, but motivation to do productive things filled that space. And it was one of the biggest years of our life. Like, we really started putting pieces together and figuring things out and becoming aware of working on things that made us happy and what those were, and just spending time in more joy and whatnot. So it was, you know, and I got to call out one of the books we read that I think really helped make it happen. There's 2 of them. There was This Naked Mind, I think, by Annie Grace. And then the other one is Alcohol Lied to Me, which I've recommended to a couple of friends, family, who have all had really similar experiences with it. And it takes a much different approach than, like, I'm not a fan of AA's approach, you know, like this idea of, you know, this is disease and, you know, you'll always have to face it and all of that. I'm like, fuck that. No, like, so, and these books take a similar approach. They're like, no, alcohol is a addictive substance, and if you drink it, you will become addicted to it. That's all there is to it. Like, it doesn't mean that you're broken or fucked up. It just means that you're taking a substance that will do this to you. And so we had a much different, like, it was a lot easier. Pretty quickly we got to where it was never like, oh, I want to drink. Like, the first situation I remember running into was, I think it was 2 months or so after we had stopped, I went to this conference in San Francisco, and they had a private party afterwards, and Macklemore was there. And like, we listened to all of his music the whole time we were building the bus. So I was like, fuck yeah, this is going to be awesome. There's like, you know, 1,000 people there at a Macklemore concert, and free alcohol, open bar everywhere. And that was the first time I really, really struggled. Yeah. And like, I walked to the bar 2 or 3 times, like, fuck it, I'm going to get a drink. And like, before I made it there, I was like, no, you're not. Like, what are you doing? That was really the only time I can remember being like, man, I want to drink. Yeah. Aside from that, it was just so easy. And part of it was like, those books we read, they just sort of deprogram your mind, and they highlight all of the cultural programming we have around alcohol, that like, it's glorified and it's amazing and it makes you sexy and it's okay and all, you know, like it pulls back the veil on a lot of that and like lets you see it from a different angle, and you're like, oh, whoa, that's different. And so it really was astonishingly easy. Once we got a couple of weeks of runway ahead of, like, behind us, I guess I should say, it was, and then we also had the side effect of, like, since we didn't just like transfer it to another process addiction, and we started like doing all kinds of cool things and like learning and just talking about more interesting stuff together, just like in our relationship, it really just took off, and then never really had to think about it again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. I think you're the first person that I know of who made that decision and then did not pursue like an AA, like a traditional sobriety type thing. That's so interesting.
Yeah, and I talked to this really interesting guy on my podcast, Dr. Rob Kelly. He actually has an addiction facility down in San Antonio, and interesting guy. And I asked him about that, because he went through AA and like he just lost, everything due to alcoholism. And I was like, I've always been uncomfortable with this idea of it's a disease and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, that's the biggest thing I face is a lot of people, like, he's like, there's alcoholics and there's people who are addicted to alcohol. Right. And Alcoholics Anonymous is for alcoholics. He's like, 9 out of 10 people that have a drinking problem are not an alcoholic. They have a substance abuse problem. So he draws kind of a line between like people that are just physically different and have like a physical addiction to alcohol, whereas it sounds like in my case it was more of just an addiction of convenience and bad habits more than anything. But like I didn't have this physical need for it like some people do, I guess.
Yeah. So to change topic and talk about sabbaticals, I am now 6 months into my sabbatical, and something that really was refreshing or inspiring was when we first connected that you had already been deep into your own sabbatical experience. And, 6 months in, and it'll probably go through the end of this year before I start to return to work. I've really been converted to the benefits of sabbaticals, and like especially for someone who's struggled with consistent or constantly being busy, like taking that break. But it has just provided so many benefits, and like I have started to champion it to so many different people, and a lot of people have said like, oh, I'm interested in taking one. What was your motivation or rationale for taking your own sabbatical?
Yeah, it wasn't super strategic. It was in a lot of ways the outcome of a couple of coincidences and just things happening and coalescing at the same time. One of them was we were selling a house that we had been renting out. So when we first got back to Washington after my second daughter was born, we bought a house, tried to be straight up normal Americans. And anyways, we moved out and we put a tenant in there and we're renting the house out and we traveled and whatnot. And it was getting to where like the market was really good and we're like, maybe we should sell that house. We had some we just didn't like that it could break. Something could break major, and it was in Washington and we were in Texas. Or like, I don't want to what if she calls us one day and like the toilet doesn't flush and I have to go like do a $20,000 repair on the sewer line? Like, I don't have the money to do that. Like, I don't want to deal with that. And so we talked to my cousin who's an agent and we're like, hey, we're thinking about selling the house. She advised us a lot. We're like, okay, we're going to go through with it. So we knew that was on the radar, I guess, or the map of things that could happen, which meant that we were going to have a bunch of money, really. So we knew that was coming. And I was just sitting on the sofa one day with my laptop on my lap. It was like 9 or 10 a.m. And I had been kind of like dissatisfied with work for a couple of years at this point, but I just kept doing it. And I must have just had this like somber, sad look on my face. My wife was like sitting across from me on like at our kitchen table. And this is in the bus. So she was like right there. And I kind of like look up and she looks at me and she's just like, are you ready to quit yet? Like, are you going to keep doing this to yourself? Cause she'd been telling me like super supportive 4 years. Like, what do we got to do? Like,
I mean, good for her for calling that out too.
Yeah, definitely. And not being like, she's always been pretty low maintenance in terms of material needs and stuff. And so like, it's not like she was expecting me to make all this money so she could support all of her own spending habits. They were very minimal. So, and we lived in a bus at that point, you know, like our expenses were low. We had kind of purposely done that in order to drive our expenses down to maybe one day get to the point where we could make a shift. And so we knew that selling the house is on the horizon, probably the next couple of months. And she just came and sat next to me, and we had actually been kind of a little bit better about our money for a few months of consistent behavior. We started looking at our accounts and we kind of added it all up. And like I said, our expenses were low, and we're like, we could coast for like at least 3 or 4 months right now on this. And we're selling the house in that time frame. So like, let's do this. So it just became a reality. It became possible. And so like that morning, I emailed my main client, because I'd been working remote and like as a contractor pretty much for years. I had pretty much one client that was 98% of my income.
Yeah.
And I emailed him. I was like, hey man, I had already like almost done this a few times. One time I kind of did, and then I like ran out of money. Like, cause like, okay, I'll keep working. I mean, I was like, I gotta unravel myself from this thing. And it was tough because like I was pretty much a CTO. I did all of the tech stuff, you know, like I did all the development. I did all the interfacing with other vendors who are helping us build stuff. Like, so I was deep into I'm still unraveling myself from that project.
Wow.
Like I have a call this week with the crew that's kind of taking over. Luckily he's found this like super competent group of people that I think are going to do a great job. So I'm happy for him, and like I'll feel guilt-free of like handing it off finally. Him and I always had like a gentleman's agreement too, like I won't walk away from you without some warning, as long as you won't just like take away all the income without warning. I've more than held up my end of the deal. This is like over a year ago. But so why the sabbatical? It became possible. And so I jumped at it. And gosh, you know what though? Like probably the biggest takeaway from it is I didn't have the same problem of workaholism at all. Like I had said, I had been trying to drive my output to zero for years. So it was pretty easy for me to not work. But it was the first time I looked in, like when the house finally sold and like I saw my bank account that day, I was like, holy shit.
Yeah, that must have been awesome.
Fuck. And, but it was the first time I had money like that, you know? And we proceeded to live like fucking rock stars. At least I did. Like, and we spent all of that money within a year. Like,
whoa.
Yeah, just went through it. Like we have a few things left, like a couple of assets left that we bought then, fortunately. And we did also, like we paid off some debts and did some things that needed to get done. Like, yeah, we did some things that needed to get done. Like it wasn't all like, we didn't just blow it on cocaine and stuff, or like I didn't spend any on that actually, but,
calf implants.
Yeah. Yeah. Calf implants, butt implants. No cosmetic surgery from that chunk of money. But you know what? We did mismanage it. And I think we both experienced some shame from that. Like, especially as we're kind of sort of coming to the end of the sabbatical and we were getting pretty low on money and like seeing our account go in one direction for a long time and getting closer and closer to like 0 day, the shame built and built and bit. And we're like, what did we do? You know, and like look back on something I spent money on and be like, that could have been another 3 months of like living expenses. Yeah. And being like, God, what did we do? But what came out of it is I learned for sure, without a doubt, that like money is nice and it's nice to feel like you have as much of it as you could possibly want, but it still doesn't fill the hole. Like you still have to do meaningful work in the world if you want to feel true happiness. Yeah. And even somebody listening to this, like you can hear me say this, but like until it's real, until you've done it, like I almost always knew like I have to like get money before I can have the realization that I don't need it to be happy.
Same. Yeah.
And I feel like I finally had that experience I haven't decided to go live in a cave or anything. Like, I'm still motivated to earn money and intend to do it. But now I know that it's spending it doesn't actually bring me happiness. And in fact, I had the counter effect of feeling a lot of unhappiness from the result of spending, you know? And this is really actually the first time I've talked about kind of feeling like we wasted that. And I'm embarrassed about it, you know? Like, there's so many, like, an idiot could have done better with that money than we did.
Well, I mean, it kind of like, it makes me think of like lottery winners who blow through it. And
Totally.
like, I don't mean that critically. Like, if you are not used to having that money and you do not have that framework of like good financial
Skills.
or just sense, it's very easy to blow through it and, you know, like wake up one day and realize like, oh, we have squandered most of it. And, you know, like I have had this similar experience myself, and like in a way with like the equity success of my last company, like I'm actually grateful that it was not this outsized windfall that I was expecting it to be, and instead it was like a very moderate amount of money, because it was not enough to, you know, go flashy and blow a bunch of money. It ended up just being like a supplement to my living expenses for most of this year.
Yeah.
And like that ended up being a blessing in disguise, because like I think I probably would have like still gone completely off the rails if it had been a much larger amount of money.
Yeah. And now, like, I look back and I'm like, I'm really grateful for that experience of like having squandered it, really is a perfect word. And now I'm like, I think that was a big part of like why I am actually saving money now. Like, I went through that experience and now I don't even think about it. I get money and I'm like, the first thing I do is put some in the savings account, put some in my Roth IRA, put some into crypto, and put some in just cash. Like, yeah. That's the very first thing I do. And I don't really think about it any other way. And I had to just go through that experience to get to where I'm at now. It'll always be probably some source of shame, but you know, it's over now. I did it, and making good decisions now. So it is what it is, and now it's time to do better.
Yeah, because you can't go back and change that, right? It's
Right.
in the past.
Yeah, it is.
Any other big takeaways from your time on sabbatical, learning experiences, or just things that you'd like to share with an audience?
I mean, I think to your point that you should do it. Like, if you're not, and maybe even if you are, but especially if you're not enamored with the work that you're doing day in and day out, if you don't love it, then you should try and orchestrate a break from it.
Yeah.
Because it's just nothing can give you the clarity that time away can give you. It's tough. A big part of it might be getting a handle on your expenses, so that, like, part of how we did it was we drove our expenses to almost nothing. You know, we were living on a couple $1,000 a month for a long time. So that helped a lot. But personal learnings, I mean, you know, the podcast came out of mine, and as we can see, it came out of yours. So yeah. You may find that you'll have nothing better to do, that it starts to become a reality to like really pour yourself into some sort of creative outlet, to do something that seems a little too big when you're working 40 to 60 hours a week.
Yeah.
All of a sudden seems not just possible, but inevitable and exciting and fun instead of terrifying. And there's still a little terror, but you have the power to get through it and the time to throw at it.
Yeah, I think that's a good indicator, like doing something that scares you a little bit.
Yeah, if you're not a little afraid, then, you know, it's probably too easy.
Right.
So, tough though. Don't jump off any buildings.
I know you had asked me to ask you about your motivation for recording today. And I think there is something there that I'm not privy to. So I did want to give you that springboard
Sure.
to jump off to talk about what you wanted to talk about.
Yeah. So this is funny. Like I had talked a little bit earlier about how whenever I have felt a little down or depressed or just not happy, I felt this guilt about how good my life really is, you know, and I look back in my past and I can't identify this clear traumatic event that, you know, would just make it really easy to be like, that's why I feel this way, you know, and now I just need to work through that and then I can feel good. And then the other, it's probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think the kids are finally asleep, laying in bed, talking to my wife. And she's like, I had this thought the other day that I wanted to ask you about because it occurred to me that you've never identified this. And so how do I sequence this? I'll just say what she said and then we'll describe the backstory. She's like, has it ever occurred to you that maybe that time that you spent in jail was a traumatic experience? And I was like, never has that occurred to me. No. So here's the backstory.
Yeah.
When I was 19, I was arrested for stealing beer from a gas station with one of my friends got arrested with me. The others got away. And I went to jail for 67 days.
Whoa.
Yeah. And so that alone, like, it's a good chunk of time.
Yeah.
But I think what was most challenging about it, you know, because there's obviously people who are in jail right now and have been there for decades. And that's fucking horrible. Jail is the stupidest thing ever. But the entire time I was there, I didn't know if I was going to get out in 3 days or 6 years.
What was going on in your life at that time? Like, were you in college? Were you working?
So I was 19. I lived with my roommate, Travis. We were selling ecstasy and weed and, like, going to raves and throwing parties. Like, I was not, like, at the top of my game. Well, I'm sure plenty of friends thought I was. But I wasn't being a good member of society,
sure,
to say the least, you know, which is why at 2 a.m. we thought we'd go steal a bunch of beer. We went to go buy it, but it was late and didn't work out. And we were too stupid to walk away. It's one of those situations, though, where if I didn't get caught doing that, I could have potentially gotten in a lot more trouble for something different later, you know, especially like selling drugs. If I'd been arrested for that, you can't get financial aid if you have a serious drug charge on your record. So I couldn't have gone to college.
Yeah.
It has overshadowed my life, you know, for a long time, all the way until very recently, you know, like even when we first moved back to Austin in 2020, it had been almost 20 years at that point. It had been 19 years since I had gotten in trouble. And being an idiot, like, we got an apartment locator, and I was like, yeah, I have a felony from like 20 years ago. Hopefully it won't be a problem. It's a problem.
Wow.
But here's the solution. Don't tell anybody. Because the only places that said they would accept us with that they still did a criminal background check, and they're like, we didn't see anything.
Yeah.
So
it's so interesting.
Oh, it's such like, and you know, it's led to so many different things. Like having that felony, I never even tried to get a job at like a big tech company. Like, it just would have been so easy to disqualify me. So I always worked for small companies. I always tried to do my own thing and start my own businesses and stuff. So there was a lot of good things from it, but there's been a lot of shitty things. And just a couple of weeks ago, it occurred to me that that experience is probably where so much of my need to have control over my life comes from, because you have it just utterly ripped out of your hands,
right?
You know, and especially in the environment I was in, it was a county jail, and like, it's weird. So like, when you get arrested, you go to jail, right?
Well, can you talk about what happened?
Oh, duh, right? I mean, the short story was we went to go buy beer, And we didn't realize it was like 2:15 a.m. or something. And in Washington State, you can't buy alcohol after 2 a.m. And we're like, oh, well, we know that guy at the gas station. Like, well, I'll give him this nug of weed and he'll probably sell it to us. Because I was a stupid 19-year-old. I thought that that'd work out that way. And maybe it would have, but that guy wasn't there. It was like the old fucking asshole who hated my friend Travis. And we're like, well, whatever. We're still going to get the beer.
Yeah.
And, we walk in and he knows what's going on from, like, he was probably dialing the police as soon as we walked in.
Yeah. He's got 911 dialed.
Yeah, exactly. And he's like, I'm not selling you guys beer. And I think I remember calling out, we weren't planning to pay for it, And everybody grabs like 2 18-packs. And we start walking towards the front door. And it was like shift change. And so this really large guy, he was about to come on shift. And, like a 6-year-old could put their foot in front of a door and you can't open it, So this giant guy puts his foot in front of the doors, and like my other 2 friends are wrenching on the doors trying to get out, can't get out. I'm like, I see the emergency exit, I go that way, start taking off, like trying to jump this fence and holding all this beer. I like dropped it all, like beers everywhere. I get up, I have like 4 beers left in my box. I'm running, and we're running, and I'm with my other friends, and I'm like, where's Luke? And they're like, I don't know. And I look back, and like the big guy like tripped him and sat on him. Oh. And so me being like dumb, gung-ho 19-year-old is like, I'm going to go save my friend. And I run over there to try to save him. And a delivery guy shows up in the middle of all this. And then he starts to get in the conflict, and him and I get in a fight. And, basically I assault him. Like him and I get in a fight, and he lost. Just, that's just how it worked out. Yeah. And then, the thing is, if you hurt somebody while you steal something, that's a robbery. So like all the cops showed up, brought us to jail, and Luke, he got out like a few days later. I think he got bail or something. And obviously I was hoping that was going to happen to me too. Fortunately, my Aunt Jeannie was in town, and she counseled my mom to not bail me out. She's like, do not do it. He needs to realize the magnitude of what he's done.
Okay.
Yeah. And when he goes to court, it's going to look a lot better if he's been there the whole time than if he just bailed out. And nothing could have been like so true. Had I been bailed out, I would have been right back in my apartment partying and being a total idiot. I probably would have left town and not gone to court or something stupid, who knows. But anyways, the court system's slow. I just sat in jail for 2 months, and it was I think we only got out like an hour a day, Monday through Friday. Wow. And then, for the first time in my life, like 3-day weekends were horrible, because that mean I was in my cell all weekend.
Did you have a cellmate?
I probably had 5 or so different ones.
Right, because they're just cycling them through.
Exactly, because that's the thing about, so when you get arrested, you go to jail. Once you get like formally charged, then they decide where you're actually going to go. And if you're going to be somewhere for very long, they usually send you to like a minimum security prison, depending on what you did. And so, but I just was there in the shitty jail the whole time. And so, I had a number of different cellmates. Luckily, all my cellmates I kind of got along with. Like, they were mostly pretty cool. But it's just such a horrible, horrible place. Like, there's no autonomy. The food is just horrible. The psychological aspect of like the guards versus the inmates, and the racism is like shockingly rampant. It feels probably like what the 60s or the 50s must have been like.
Do you mean between
all races?
But do you mean like from the guards, or like with
the
people?
Between the inmates even? Because a lot of people that are in jail have been there lots of times. Right. So they kind of like know the deal. And so, like people really do group up with their race, and whether you subscribe to those notions or not, like you can't violate them. You can't hang out with the black guys. You can't hang out with the Mexican guys or the Indian guys or anything. Like, you hang out with the white dudes if you're a white dude. And like at this one time I almost got in a fight with this dude because he would always walk around like act like a super like stoned stupid white surfer guy. I don't give a fuck. You know, I was heads down. I was like, I'm trying to get out of this place.
Right.
I don't want to get in trouble. You know, I'm not arguing with anybody. And I don't even remember what happened, but he sort of like called me out one day. Like we had some thing and you can't back down from that, you know, otherwise you're just going to get, everybody's going to pick on you.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, oh, fuck. You know, and I like go out into this kind of hallway, and it was kind of like a hidden section where the guards wouldn't be able to see unless they were looking like up there. And it just worked out. Like I didn't know the rules of engagement or anything, but I was just like, well, I'm not starting this fight. Like if this dude wants to fight me and it gets violent, then I guess we'll do it. But like, I'm not starting this. And apparently like the rules of engagement are if like he calls you out, then he has to throw the first punch. So I just lucked out there, and I was just like, didn't do anything. He didn't do anything. I technically won since like he called me out, didn't throw it. So like it worked out in terms of like building my credibility. Luckily it was really close to the end of the whole thing, my time there. And so I was able to get out pretty soon, but yeah, apparently that could have be considered a traumatic event. And that never occurred to me.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you, do you have any sense of what the fallout was from that internally in the time that followed that? I mean, it sounded like you turned your life around based on that experience, but like what?
Yeah.
Was there any fallout for you?
I think I remember prior to the experience feeling a little disconnected from my family and feeling like my friends were my family. You know, like my friends, yeah, that's like all that mattered to me. And I remember like being in jail, and one of my best friends had sent me a letter. Like, hey man, what's up? Hope everything's cool. Once you get back out, we'll get everything going again. And I'm just like, yeah, fucking right. I don't want anything to do with anything wrong. Yeah. Never breaking the law again. I'm so scared. But like, you know, it's like one paragraph of, hey, what's up? And then the next one is like, hey, can I have the couch and stuff? I got a new apartment. And I was just like, and he was one of the only people who even wrote me a letter. So it was like everybody who I thought was so important to me vanished.
Yeah.
Gone. And the one who did write me is like asking for my furniture, you know? And then my whole extended family, like everybody would send me letters, send me books. Like they were the ones who supported me, you know? And so that realization there was like, oh, it's my family that matters.
It also feels like, sorry to cut you off, but it also feels like another version of that thing we were talking about earlier in terms of like when you have these unhealthy habits, like you surround yourself with these unhealthy people. Yeah. And, you know, like you have this realization of like, oh, if I go away, like all this goes away too. If I'm not in that circle, then I don't exist. Yeah,
it was definitely that. And then one thing that happened, we had a big circle of friends, you know, it's like a good crew of at least 20, 30 people. Like we were all tight, you know, and like we thought we were tough, and a lot of other people did. And we were cool. Everybody got along, you know? And then when I got out 2 months later, like a lot of people fucking hated each other.
Yeah.
And I don't know if like I was the glue kind of like holding people together. It's a little grandiose to think that it was all on me. It's probably just a number of things that kind of fell apart. But I just remember being like, why are you so mad at him? Like, and why are you mad? Like, he didn't do anything to me. Like, I'm sorry, you guys disagree, but like, you know, he's still my friend.
Right.
So, and like, so I didn't even have the same friend group. I couldn't be friends with everybody. So part of the falling out was like a lot of friends didn't like each other anymore. So we didn't have the same crew. And I was really scared to get in trouble again, you know, cause I was on probation and like all the stuff, like the system is just utterly designed to keep you in it.
Yeah.
You know, you got to have everything stacked in your favor, a little bit of luck, a lot of support to even have some chance of getting out of it. It's a broken fucking system.
Yeah, it's so depressing.
It's horrible.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, that That is a curveball. I did not see that one coming.
It always shocks people. I kind of stopped telling the story, because I'm like, there's no need to. It happened so long ago. It's been over 20 years now,
Yeah.
But after my wife pointed that out, I was like, ooh, that's I never thought about that.
Yeah. So to switch gears, something else that I did want to ask you about, and something that we connected on early, was exploring psychedelics. And I did want to ask you about your journey into that, and then what the experiences have been like, and what the takeaways have been for you.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you brought that up. Different from you, I had a lot of early psychedelic experience. So mostly recreational, well, all recreational really when I was younger. The very first time I ate mushrooms, I think I was in 8th or 9th grade. And it was actually not a good experience at all. I did not realize what I was getting myself into. And it was pretty scary.
I mean, you were like 14 or 15 at
Yeah.
the time? Wow, that's intense.
Right. Yeah. But it was the friends I was hanging out with. They had some. They're like, hey, let's do it. And I think I just I never would drink with them so part of the story there is like my dad had a lot of trouble with alcohol. And that kept me really scared of alcohol until I was like 18 or so,
Right.
maybe like 16 or something. But anyways, so a lot of times they would drink and I was always like, oh no, I don't want to, And so I always kind of felt a little ostracized, like not quite in tight with everybody because, honestly, people bond when drinking together a lot, and I never did. So I didn't want to miss out on that, I think. And so I was like, okay, yeah, I'll do them, because I would smoke weed with them, and that was fine with me. And it felt a little more like in that vein than in the drinking vein. I wasn't as scared of it, but the experience itself was pretty scary. I didn't have a good time. I didn't like that lack of control. I wasn't in control of the situation, and like my eyes were not communicating to me what I expected to be there, and that was disconcerting, to say the least. And then I didn't really mess with them for a couple of years. And through high school, I was a little, I guess depressed, I wasn't as popular as I wanted to be, or as like cool with the girls as I wanted to be. Like, I had some cool friends, but I was never like the cool guy, sometimes I was associated with some cool people, and I always felt small and kind of like scared of people. Like, I really wanted to avoid any violence or altercations for the most part, and I don't know, wasn't happy. And I didn't really know what depression was, but I felt that way a little bit. And then some of my friends had like gone to a rave in Seattle and had done ecstasy, and they're like, it's the best, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, cool, I want to go. So I remember going to a party in Bellingham, actually. It's called Water, outdoor rave.
Okay.
And took 2 pills of ecstasy, MDMA, and I think it's pure MDMA, because like they were really strict. They're like, it's got to be Molly. Don't get the fucking cut shit.
Yeah.
And I remember I hadn't felt that good ever that I could remember. Like, it was like this deep internal knowing that everything was going to be okay. And I hadn't remembered ever having that experience before. And it was really like a turning point in my whole mental state. Like, just getting to glimpse that state of mind was possible was enough to like catapult me out of that like just meh state of being.
Yeah.
But I obviously associated that a little bit with the substance, and did lots of psychedelics for a couple of years, and not lots, but like, 20 or 30 times probably, mushrooms or LSD or ecstasy, or mixing them, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And yeah, so lots of recreational use, like in my late teens, early 20s. And then I like started going to college, moved away, and just stopped knowing the people that had access to those things, and so stopped doing them. And then every like couple 3-4 years I would come across it and be like, oh yeah, I haven't done that in a while, and less and less though, until a couple of years ago, like the psychedelic renaissance started happening. And being a lot older and focused on different things, seeing it as a way to, I wasn't so much looking at it to like excavate or uncover or process any trauma, because like I said, I wasn't even really aware of any. I always looked at it more as like an optimization thing. Right. Like maybe this could unlock new levels.
Yeah, like mind expansion.
Yeah, exactly. And then even actually starting to learn a little bit about trauma the last few years and being kind of like, oh yeah, I do see that. Like maybe I don't have the specific event, but like I feel these things that they're talking about. And then coming up on my 40th birthday last year, I had the opportunity to sort of orchestrate a bit of a guided psychedelic experience with 2 friends who were both very capable and I thought would be good people to be around for the experience, and they had a good environment for me to do it. So I took like 5 hits of LSD and hung out with my friends, and they really just like similarly, like they were just there for me.
Yeah.
And kind of helped like guide the experience and make sure everything else was taken care of. And I went into it expecting one thing, and then kind of like one of my main foci, the main intentions I had was to improve my relationship, especially with my older daughter, because I'd feel at odds with her sometimes, but then I'd feel horrible about it. Like I don't want to fight with my kid. Like I want to be her protector. And so that was one of my main things I went into it. It was like, I want to improve my relationship with my older daughter, which I did. But like, it took like 10 minutes of like time to be like, to get through that. And it had a big improvement. And the rest of the time though, like I really spent thinking about my brother a lot and our relationship. And then probably the most of the time actually was just thinking about my dad.
Yeah.
And so like, we had mentioned him and my mom split up when I was the summer after the summer, like right as kindergarten ended. So quite a while ago, but I never really like held anything against him. I wasn't mad at him. And that was sort of my belief throughout my whole adulthood, was like, whatever, like they needed to break up. I'm glad they didn't stay together, like, and I was always sort of an apologist for my dad. Like, he was going through his own things, his dad was probably 10 times worse than he was to me. And what came up and kind of surprised me was, which is weird because like right now I don't feel it, but like a lot of anger towards him. Like I was really mad at him, and I was so surprised by that, but it was almost cathartic in a sense. Like it almost felt good to acknowledge that things weren't perfect, and I wish that they were different, and they weren't, God damn it. And I had this deep sense for a long time of like, a phrase I use a lot that my wife has also kind of highlighted, that like, why do you do that? It's like, I'll call people pussies. Like I have this like sense of like, don't be such a fucking baby. Like it irritates me when people are weak.
Yeah.
And I think I got that from my father a lot, because he was very similar, like not much tolerance for weakness. And so the main takeaway there, like, I had sort of like 3 outcomes. One, my perspective and like my communication and my like connection with my daughter was vastly improved. Like always still work to do and like improvements to make, but like a lot got better there. And I feel like we are at odds a lot less now. Like usually, or at the very least, like sometimes I'll get irritated, but I catch myself and I at least like don't do the damage of like being an asshole or something, I'll catch, or I will, and I'll catch it and I'll be like, I'm sorry. I'll address it. I won't just like let it go away. I'll be like, that wasn't cool. I'm sorry. was an asshole, or, I'm sorry I yelled at you.
Yeah.
And it's like, that goes so far with a kid, like to just like, they will forgive you. Like it's almost astonishing how quickly a child can forgive their own parents. It's almost like unfair. If you just like look at them and say, sorry, dude, they fucking love you.
Yeah.
It's great. The second thing was my brother was kind of going through some personal things, and I won't go into that because it's his story, and maybe someday he'll want to tell it. But he needed some brotherly support, and I was really struggling to do it. Like I did not know how to talk about it or how to bring it up, and I knew that in the moment, like I said it out loud multiple times. Like he just needs me to call him on the phone and say this to him. Like, why am I so afraid to do it? And it was hard, and it took me a few days afterwards, but like I managed to like meekly like get through it, and I could have done a better job, but I think that ultimately played the role that I needed to play, to be a better older brother.
Yeah.
But then the big thing was like the relationship with my dad, and I, honestly, I bet that's probably still where there's the most work left to do, is because even like right now, like I'm not mad at him, but I'm not saying I should be, like, but there's some unprocessed stuff there.
Yeah.
Which gives me something to focus on. Like I think there's a lot more there than I realize.
Yeah, I mean that had been on my list of questions, was like if your dad was still alive, and then what the relationship is like now, and like to kind of speak to your point again. This is something that I seem to encounter a lot of, like, and this was definitely true in my case. I didn't know how to express anger as a child, and like even as an adult, I would say I'm not an angry person, but I have a lot of anger. And when there are these unmet needs in childhood, and this is again definitely true in my case, like I think a lot of people struggle with this in terms of like, it is okay for me to feel anger at this parent figure who did not meet this need, while also balancing, acknowledging this person did the best they could with what they had at the time. And I think that duality is very tricky and very challenging for a lot of people. And, finding grace for that person and saying like, okay, like their life was not going so great at that time, but they were still like trying to put it together. And, like everybody, they were just an imperfect person, and they had their flaws and their struggles, while not minimizing like, hey, this was this is a very sad or lonely or unhappy time for me.
Yeah.
It's tough, and it's something that I still struggle with. And, like even having done so many medicine sessions and so much therapy, like it's still a tightrope that I have trouble walking.
I bet. Yeah, I mean, you really nailed it with like that duality of forgiving, but also acknowledging your own frustration or anger in this case. It's hard, like we like things to be clear and black and white, and when things get muddy, our human minds, I don't think, are very well suited to managing that and understanding it. It's just so utterly nebulous and hard to deal with.
Yeah. And I'm also curious, and it's funny because I had written this question down in terms of like the different aspects of your life, like how had psychedelics changed it? And like I wrote down 4, and the last 3 are as a better father, brother, and friend. But the first one is, has it changed you as a husband?
Yeah. I think, interestingly, I'm glad you brought that up, because on the one hand, I'm so fortunate that like one day we'll get more into the story with my wife and I, and maybe it'll be when you talk to her and you'll get to see her perspective. But she's so awesome. Like I couldn't have found a more awesome like partner to take life on with. And it's hard to like, how do I say this? Like, so there's this layer of like, I need to process, some things with my dad for sure. And there's probably even some remaining things like with my relationship with my brother that I would like to like, don't get me wrong. I love my brother. Our relationship's probably better than it has ever been. But like, I'd still like it to be better. Why not make it better?
Yeah.
And then underneath all of this, I feel like there's this part of me, there's something I have to figure out with like my relationship to women in general. Like and until I can like figure out what that is, I feel like it's hard for me to be the best husband I can be. Some of it maybe comes from, maybe this is another traumatic event that I forgot about. Like this girl I dated we broke up when I think I was 20. And I was like, I thought she was the most awesome person ever. I was super stoked about her. She broke up with me and left town and like moved back to where she lived. And it just like ripped my heart out.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've ever quite recovered from that. Like I still hold back because I'm afraid to be hurt like that again. And I know my wife is the last person in the world that would like walk away from me. I would have to do some utterly grotesque shit to make her leave me. Like I would have to just be a complete asshole, to where I deserved nothing less. And yet I still fear that I hold back my own just like love and affection because I'm so fucking scared of being hurt.
Right.
By somebody
that
again.
Scar tissue is there.
Yeah. So I think there's definitely some work to be done in psychedelics to like overcome that so that I can experience those benefits of being a better husband. So far, I don't think I got too deep into that in my really only therapeutic focused experience with psychedelics.
Yeah.
So more work to be done for sure.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience, and it was much later. It was, early 30s, and it took me like a good 4 or 5 years to actually work through. And, like that was with focusing on it in a talk therapy setting. Yeah. And, it even there were some insights that surfaced in some of my medicine sessions about that. And, it's just something like that, especially if you have a lot of abandonment in your childhood, it really just stabs you right through the heart.
Yeah.
And like it can take a lot to recover from that for sure.
Yeah, it's still there, and like that's one my awareness on that topic has grown more and more. I think probably also not having as much like success with girls, like being young, like high school. Part of that's in there,
Yeah.
And it's hard for me to like see an attractive woman and not like think like, oh, she's hot. And then I feel guilty. Like, you're fucking married. Your wife is awesome. She's super hot too. Like, why can't you not just see a pretty person and not like be like, oh, they're fucking hot? Like,
right.
What the fuck?
Yeah.
Like, why? Like, what is wrong with me? But I'm optimistic that with the trajectory I'm on and like the path that I think both my wife and I are taking in terms of preparing for some psychedelic assisted work, I'm really excited to see like what's on the other side of some of that and to just like get through this,
Yeah, that was also a question I wanted to ask. And I know you had some conversations with people in this space and were potentially strategizing from that. Do you have any future plans for experiences in this vein?
I mean, I have lots of future plans, but no like commitments or dates set.
Yeah.
I was pretty, and I still want to go through the Ibogaine 5-MeO experience. And I was like pretty close to committing, but funny enough, like as soon as I started making money again, my willingness to spend it got a lot tighter. And it's for a non-veteran, like it's a really cool program. They'll bring veterans at zero cost, which I'm 100% supportive of. But for a civilian, it's like $4,500.
Yeah.
Which like worth it for sure. But I just started working again a couple of months ago, and we're making some pretty massive changes and committing to kind of like a much higher cost of living than I've had for ever, really. And so I kind of want to like we're moving in about a month. I want to get some things dialed in and just like look at the finances and be like, okay, is this going to be safe before I go and spend? I just don't want to end up in a situation like, say, come January where I'm like looking at this massive shortfall of cash and being like, oh, you should have went and done that psychedelic experience.
Right.
You could have been supporting your family now. And so I think I'm probably we're looking into a few options that are a little more affordable. And in some sense, I think we'll build up. Like the Ibogaine is a pretty harrowing journey from what I hear.
It's extreme, yeah.
So probably would be good to build up to that. And you know what? Maybe I'll go through some things and come to the realization that I don't need to go through that. I'm not sure. I think it was kind of like one of those things, like I mentioned earlier, the more afraid I am of some things up to a certain point, the more I'm like, that's the answer. And there's some aspects of Ibogaine, like I'm sort of enamored by that terror of it. Like I want to go I want my heart ripped out for a little bit, and I want to just like see it fucking struggling. And like I almost like in some sense I want the clarity to like kind of see this is what it is, Danny. Like this is what's in front of you. Like let's start taking this seriously and make it happen, because every day that goes by that I'm not like taking real concrete action towards this stuff, I'm kind of like, oh, like, but it's hard, life is, there's so much, there's so much to do.
Yeah. And, like that's not a decision to be taken lightly.
Yeah, that too.
But also, like, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with being gentle with yourself. Like with Ibogaine and 5-MeO DMT, you are really signing up to strap yourself to a rocket ship, and that could invite significant life change. So like I don't think there's anything wrong with being like, all right, I'm gonna take baby steps into this decision.
Yeah. So that's where things are now. I think we're both my wife and I are likely slated to, I think we're going to try and do some ketamine stuff this year before the year's up. We were looking into like, there's a couple of clinics here in Austin. Like I interviewed Tatiana, who has a clinic here. And I really want to do it, but there's some online programs that are just like an order of magnitude less in cost. It's like $400 a month for 3 months as opposed to $4,000. Yeah. For roughly a month or 6 weeks of sessions.
I'm guessing the difference in price is level of care.
Yeah, it's level of care is definitely part of it. I'm also a big believer in you get what you pay for, so like I like to think of myself as like a value shopper. I'm usually unlikely to buy the cheapest thing if for no other reason that it's the cheapest. In this case, I think a big part of the cost difference is that you don't have to like go to a facility, like it's online care. It's not intramuscular injection. It's just a lozenge that you like keep in your mouth. And so the experience is probably a little bit different, but the cost is different enough that I'm like, well, I guess I'm willing to try it. And I'd still ultimately, just for no other reason, like aside from my personal interest in like doing the work. I kind of want to like do it all from the perspective of creating content and like telling other people that this stuff exists, you know, like this, and I can relay my personal story. Like this is what I went through. So we'll see, like something has got to happen. But, you know, when you and I talked earlier and you mentioned that people should tread lightly and do some preparation work, I'm like, yeah, I do want to do a little more preparation before I just like wade into things. So
yeah, I think that's the right way to approach it.
Yeah. But I also like, I don't want to wait too long. You know, I think that's kind of why I was like, go to Mexico and do the 5 in the or the ibogaine, like just because then there's no turning back. You know, you can't get out of it.
I get it. Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, I think this is a good place to wrap.
Agreed.
And I really appreciate you showing up today, sharing your story, sharing what you did. That was definitely a curveball, but I think I got a lot out of the insights that you brought to today. And again, I am grateful not just for that, but for all of the assistance that you have provided to me in starting this podcast for the last several months. So I wanted to say a very heartfelt thank you to you, Danny, and I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, David. Like I said in the beginning, thank you as well. Like, I do try to be generous with my time, and you expressed an interest in podcasting, and I was excited about it. I got to know you. I like your idea. I think it's an authentically compelling show, and you did it. You know, like, look at this setup here. You put in the work. You did it. You put your story out there. So I'm glad I could play like a minor role in encouraging you, but also congrats.
Thank you.
You did this.
Awesome. Thanks.